saying I, Paul, or Paul greet you, or something like that. But he didn't do this in this one. All right, it could have been for multiple reasons. We don't know. But it is believed that it is the Apostle Paul. Hebrews, if you can understand this book, will make you a biblical scholar. There are two books that if you learn them, you will be on the roadmap to being a biblical scholar. And that is Romans and Hebrews. It is deep, heavy type teaching though. So I'm going to ask that you bear with me and go. And I'm going to try to make it as plain and simple as I possibly can concerning this chapter. So let's jump right in. Hebrews chapter 9. And Paul is writing this to the Hebrews. Now understand what was going on. Some of the church folk, the Christians that had converted from Judaism to Christianity. However, they were trying to hang on to the old Jewish traditions and get under the rituals of the New Testament. They were trying to come under grace and mercy and all of this stuff, but then they were going, but we still like all the stuff we used to do under the Old Testament too. Can we have both? No. I mean, can't we please God through all of these works and sacrifices and yet still please God through faith and grace? And Paul has to address this situation. But he also had a different sect. He had a group of Jews who didn't convert to Christianity. They were Pharisees, they were Sadducees, they were scribes, and they were saying, all of this Christianity stuff is bull. We believe in the laws of Moses and all of the Old Testament rituals. And everybody said, ooh, yeah, Old Testament. Now, today we have religions right now who are still doing the same. Some religions are saying, well, we Christians, but we still follow all of the Old Testament rituals. Some people say, well, we know the New Testament, but we don't believe in that. We only believe in the Old Testament. So we're going to find out what happens if you say, well, let's jump back into the Old Testament. We want to distinguish the difference between Old and New Testament. And Hebrews chapter 9 does that. Start off, Antoine, would you please start reading for me?
Then verily the first covenant had also ordinances of divine service and a worldly sanctuary. Okay, so he's talking about the first covenant. The first covenant made with Moses. Understand there was laws given to Moses. The Ten Commandments. We all saw the old movie, and he had the big hair, and he would what was that guy that played it? Not Charlton Heston, but I forget his name. But anyway, he came down off the mountain with the streak of gray, you know, and it had the bad background. You didn't realize how bad the graphics was until you get older. But he comes down, and he has the Ten Commandments, and all of a sudden the Jews are like, ooh, God has spoken. And from that point on, Moses laid down tons and tons of laws that the Jews had to follow. And as they start following these laws over time, God allowed them to build a huge temple that they would go in and worship under. Now, understand, these laws, even though they probably were excited over them at first, eventually became a pain in their butt. Why would laws become a pain in the butt? Think about the laws we have right now, the laws of the land. How many of you all, if there was no speeding law, would still go 65? None of us. How many of you all, even though there is a law that says go 65, go past 65? I would say probably all of us. That law is a pain in our butt. Now I'm sure when people was getting killed at one point because of speeding, everybody cried out, we need some type of laws. We want some type of regulation. Until that law stepped on your toes. Until you're late. And you try to get past, you're like, man, the other day I broke this speeding law. And the man pulled me over and had grace and mercy upon me. Now, did I know that I was going as fast as I was? No. I mean, I didn't even know it was 55. I'm flying. I'm like, wait, he said 65? No, son, it's 55. You know, but he let me slide. But the point that I'm trying to make is, life would be easier without those laws. So, what happened is the Jews didn't realize that laws would be such a pain in the butt until God threw them down there to Moses. Now, all of a sudden, they're going, wait a minute, hold up. Moses, you telling us we can't do what? And we can't do this, we can't do, and what's going to happen if we do? Well, God's going to stone you. Or God might smite you. Or God might cripple you, or all of this stuff. So now you understand how stringent the Old Testament became. These people couldn't do anything. And so God was telling the people under the Old Testament, he said, if you mess up, the only way you're going to get me off your back is through some type of sacrifice. When a person sinned, I am required, being God, he said, being holy, I have to deal with that sin. I cannot let it go as if it didn't happen. I can't turn my back, turn my head, I can't wink at it, I can't chuckle over it, I can't say, well, for you it's okay, but for you, God said I have to deal with all sin. Therefore, for me to not kill you, I need something to die in your place. So he said, I will allow you to take a lamb, a sacrificial lamb. But this lamb must be perfect. I will not allow a dirty, unclean sacrifice to die for sin. So he said this perfect little lamb, it can't have runny eyes, it can't have messed up hoofs, it can't have any mites on it or anything. They would take this lamb, and for months after months, they would examine the lamb. And they would clean the lamb. And they would make sure the lamb was perfect. And the lamb was for one purpose only, and that was to die for the sins of the people. So now all of these people had this beautiful temple of Solomon, and they had the lambs, and God allowed them to have priests. And the priest's job was to stand in the place of the people, and he was to say, Lord, I'm coming to you on behalf of the people. And I'm going to give this sacrifice so that you don't kill me or kill the people. And the people will go, yay, God is off our back. And 5 minutes later they sin and say, we need another sacrifice. Now that is frustration. So here is the Old Testament. It says, then verily the first covenant had also ordinances and divine services and worldly sanctuaries. A worldly sanctuary was the building. This is why you cannot fall in love with the building. Amen. Some people get excited because their church is so beautiful and so godly. However, I am under the influence that you can be in a little storefront church and be rocking. Some of y'all didn't get a chance to visit First Pentecostal Church of Blue Ash before we moved over into where we are now. I came to that spot, and it was about as big as this spot right here. There was times I'd be downstairs in the restroom, and they'd be having church upstairs, and I'm saying to myself, at any second, the whole floor is going to collapse, and I'm going to become a casualty. You know? And I mean, the church was so small, the walls would be sweating, and you could hear the music halfway down the street because the church was so small, people calling the cops on us, but the anointing and the presence of God was there. And so some people think just because their cathedral is beautiful and big, that must mean God is pleased with it. This Old Testament law, they had a big building. All that building was a place that they would come and meet at for worship. But it wasn't representation of God simply dwelling there or us containing God there. If you think your church is the only church that has the presence of God in it, you're mistaken. I know the anointing might be flowing in your church, y'all doing the do dancing and shouting, but I guarantee you there's another church somewhere in Alabama that's out shouting you. There's another preacher up in Detroit somewhere that might be out preaching your preacher. I mean, trust me, the Lord visits multiple places. So people cannot fall in love with the building like the Jews. They had fell in love with how beautiful the Temple of Solomon was. They were like, look at this thing. This is godly. This is beautiful. And so it goes on to say, it's a worldly sanctuary. Read, Antoine, please.
There was a tabernacle made. The first word was a candlestick and the table and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary.
Continue.
And after the second veil, the tabernacle, which is called the holies of all.
Now stop right there. Now, understand, the first part of this tabernacle had different things in it. The candlesticks and the table and the showbread, which is called the sanctuary. Some people were allowed to come into the sanctuary. Just like the regular church, we can go into the sanctuary now. But then God had a special part that nobody can go past. And that was called the holies of holies. That was the spot where he said, you got to be absolutely clean to roll up in this spot. Not everybody.